Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome to the channel. Since UFC 292, Ian Machado Garry has been getting a lot of hate from the MMA community, and the majority of it is surrounding Ian Machado Garry calling out Neil Magny for something he said in a pre-fight presser into the lead-up of UFC 292 regarding Neil Magny's son. Now, we're going to take a look at that clip later in the video because some people are saying Neil Magny said this, some people are saying Neil Magny said that. We're going to take a look at his actual words, and I'm going to give my opinion on the situation. But there's also been a lot of things said about Ian Machado Garry that I feel like is a little bit unwarranted by the MMA community just because now they dislike him for whatever reason. And I feel like there's a massive hypocrisy here that nobody's really talking about. It's kind of an unpopular opinion. I know a lot of people aren't going to like this opinion, but we're going to talk about it in this video. And one of the first things I want to say is people are talking about Ian Machado Garry's performance against Neil Magny like it was a horrible performance. They're saying, oh, he should have finished Neil Magny. You know, it was underwhelming. It wasn't a very impressive performance. Ian Machado Garry went out there and absolutely wrecked Neil Magny from start to finish. He brutalized his legs. He had Neil Magny butt scooting across the octagon canvas like he was Claudio Puelles and absolutely wrecked him. And even, I think, one judge gave him 3 10-8 rounds. It was utter domination. It was utter destruction. And it was a masterclass performance. He went out there and beat Neil Magny from start to finish. Looked for the finish the entire time. Was landing combinations, landing front kicks. Was literally just being super aggressive up until the last second of the third round. And I hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, Ian Garry should have gotten the finish. He should have finished Neil Magny. He should have got him out of there. How could he not finish a guy with no legs? And I feel like there's multiple things wrong with that particular statement. First off, oh, he didn't finish Neil Magny. Neil Magny, since the beginning of his career all the way back in 2010, his pro career, so he's been fighting for 13 years. I think he has something like 40 fights. He's been finished twice by TKO, and he has not been finished by TKO since 2017, almost 6 years ago. I believe it was November 2017. So 6 years ago was the last time Neil Magny was finished via TKO. So Neil Magny is one of the most durable fighters in the welterweight division. He's a guy that, okay, he does get submitted. He is able to be out-grappled and submitted by some of the elite grapplers like Gilbert Burns. But to TKO Neil Magny is a very difficult task. And on top of that, I feel like there's multiple times the referee could have jumped in. I mean, I think there's a chance that another referee would have stopped this fight on multiple occasions. He dropped Neil Magny probably, 10 times from leg kicks? And people keep saying, oh, how could he not finish a guy with no legs? Why do you think he had no legs? Why do you think he had no legs? Because Ian Garry destroyed his legs. It goes back to the same thing of Bilal Muhammad versus Gilbert Burns. Oh, he couldn't finish Gilbert. Gilbert had no shoulder. But well, what happened? Where did he get that shoulder injury? It happened in the fight. Stop acting like Neil Magny came in and had no legs coming into the fight and Ian Garry couldn't finish him anyway. Now, I will say, even though I do believe this is an impressive performance, I don't think it's the end-all, be-all. I don't think it's some, number one contender type performance where all of a sudden he earns a title shot. But actually, I'm going to talk about Ian Garry and a title shot in the future because I do think there's a case to be made that you could give him a title shot right now. I know a lot of people aren't going to like that, but we'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But I'm not saying it's this, oh my goodness, it's not this, I'm trying to think of a crazy performance in like a number one contender fight or a title fight. It's not like a Sean O'Malley, Aljamain Sterling type of performance where Sean O'Malley went out there and brutally finished Aljamain Sterling in the second round. It's not that type of performance, but Ian Garry came in, fought a guy who's been a basically top 10 gatekeeper for a long time and absolutely dominated him from start to finish. That was a super impressive victory, and I think it deserves credit. Now, can we say, okay, Neil Magny took the fight on short notice. Neil Magny isn't the greatest fighter in the world? Of course. Can we say Neil Magny's on the downslope a little bit? Sure. But Neil Magny's still a very good fighter. He's a very well-rounded fighter. And we've really never seen, outside of the grappling, we've never seen someone go out there and really decimate Neil Magny in the way that Ian Garry decimated Neil Magny at UFC 292. Now, the other thing I keep hearing people say, they say, oh, Ian Garry's overhyped. Ian Garry's overrated. I don't see people claiming that Ian Garry is going to be a 2-division champion. I see very few people saying he's even going to be a future champion. If anything, I think Ian Garry's underrated. I think a lot of people are saying, oh, he's no good. He's not that good. He's going to get exposed. I can't wait to see him lose. He's going to lose. He's going to get destroyed. He would have got destroyed by Jeff Neal. I've seen a lot of people say that. Now, the UFC, of course, is going to hype up Ian Garry because they want to hype him up because he has the Irish accent. He's from Ireland. They want to use him as a potential UK star. So, of course, they're going to push him and promote him. And I just think it's crazy for people to act like, oh, he's overhyped. I think he put on one of the best performances he possibly could have put on at UFC 292, absolutely destroying Neil Magny. And I don't think he's overrated. I don't think he's overhyped at all. And then people are really saying, oh, well, Ian Machado Garry, he's just a Conor McGregor wannabe. Oh, because he's talked a little bit of trash. He said a couple things where, oh, these are lines from Conor McGregor. Ian Machado Garry is an admitted fanboy of Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor was his hero, his inspiration. He's not allowed to recite a couple lines from him. He's not allowed to say, you'll do effing nothing. Oh, I didn't know. Did Conor McGregor have a trademark on that? He's not allowed to say that. Now, I don't enjoy the trash talk all that much from anyone, but it's just crazy to me. People are saying, oh, he's just a Conor McGregor wannabe. He's just a Family Dollar Conor McGregor. Okay, well, maybe he's a Family Dollar Conor McGregor in the trash talk, but he actually fights. Ian Machado Garry actually fights. He has 6 UFC wins since 2021. You know how far back you have to go to get 6 UFC wins from Conor McGregor? I'll save you the trouble. You have to go back all the way to 2015. If you count 6 wins from Conor McGregor in the UFC, you have to go back to his win against Dennis Seaver in 2015. So Ian Machado Garry, say what you will. Oh, he's a Conor McGregor wannabe, but he's literally actually fighting. He's moving up the ranks. He's willing to take on all comers. He's willing to fight his way up the ladder. He's not begging for gifted certain fights that are super favorable matchups. And he makes fights interesting by building certain storylines leading into the fight. So I just think it's crazy that people are so focused on, oh, Ian Garry's a Conor McGregor wannabe. Conor McGregor doesn't fight. Conor McGregor sits on the sideline and tweets. Conor McGregor sits on the sideline and uses performance-enhancing drugs and doesn't enter the USADA pool. So I just hate those comments. Now, another thing, and I never thought I would ever talk about this in a video, but I had to include it in this video, and I had to research this beforehand because I really never even bothered to care about this before. But there is a lot of people that dislike Ian Garry who were so focused on the fact that he has the name Machado in his name. He changed his name from Ian Garry to Ian Machado Garry. And I've seen a lot of people say, Ian Garry's a cuck. Ian Garry took his wife's ex-husband's last name. And I've kind of ignored it. I've seen it countless times, honestly, probably over 100 times in the last 2 weeks alone. They're like, oh, this guy, look at him. He's taking his wife's ex-husband's last name. What a weirdo. What a cuck. That's a common thing. For some reason, the MMA fan base is just infuriated about another man's last name or hyphenated last name or whatever you want to call it, double last name. So I went ahead and Googled it. I'm like, is this even true? I don't know if this is even true because I've never worried about it. As a grown man, I've never personally wondered about another grown man's last name. And I found out, according to John Anik and Megan O'Leary, they say further dove into the matter to explain more. His wife, Layla, is Brazilian and Machado was her last name. She has a son who also has Machado in his name. Further, O'Leary added, now they're expecting again. They wanted to make sure that their brothers had a name in common. So they felt like they were all one big family with co-parenting. So they all added it to their name so no one left out. So Ian Garry added Machado to his name. It's his wife's maiden name. It's not her ex-husband's name because she had a child from a previous marriage whose last name is Machado, and she wanted her new son and her previous son to have the same last name. So they all said, well, let's have Machado in their last name. So Ian Garry became Ian Machado Garry. There's no problem with that. There's no problem with that. And apparently it's customary in Brazil for a husband to take a wife's last name. I've never seen so many people so just disgusted with another grown man's last name. They are so infuriated by it. I've seen so many people mention it over and over and over again. And it's not even true that it's her ex-husband's last name. It's her maiden name that he now included because he didn't want his stepson and his new son to have different last names. So in my opinion, it's actually admirable. I think it's good of Ian Garry to do that. I don't see any problem with it. I don't care if Ian Garry wants to change his name to make up whatever name you want. If he wants to change his name to John, I don't care. Because guess what? I don't spend my time thinking about other people's last names. So if you're worried about that, you are a straight up weirdo. And that's something apparently a lot of the MMA community cares about. Now, the other thing that people are really upset about with Ian Machado Garry is he called out Neil Magny for some comments he made in the lead up to their fight at UFC 292. And he basically said that, look, Neil Magny's bragging about child abuse. That's essentially what Ian Garry said. He called him out for it. He said, look, this is what he's saying in the lead up to the fight. And I've seen people say, oh, that's not what Neil Magny said. Okay, that's what he said. I've seen people twist it around and defend Neil Magny and say this and that. Let's take a look at what Neil Magny actually said in the pre-fight presser in the lead up to UFC 292, and then we'll come back and react to it.
And there's a whooping that you give your son now, like to kind of teach him life a little bit. And being a father, I've become quite accustomed to that kind of whooping now, and that's kind of what I'm looking forward to giving on Saturday.
So there you hear Neil Magny himself. There's a beating that you give your son to teach him a life lesson. And as a dad, I've become accustomed to giving those beatings, and that's the type of beating I'm going to give Ian Garry on Saturday night. Neil Magny said he was accustomed to giving out those type of beatings now that he's a dad, okay? How frequently is he giving out these types of beatings? How frequently that he's accustomed to it? Because guess what? His son is 3 years old. His son is 3 years old. Now, Ian Garry called him out for this. Ian Garry used this to kind of build a narrative, to hype up this fight, and to use it as fuel and motivation to go out there and beat up Neil Magny. And a lot of people are saying, oh, that's not what Neil Magny meant. It was a joke. It was bad, cringy trash talk, this and that. Neil Magny basically said, I physically abused my 3-year-old son. He said, I have become accustomed to giving out those beatings. And I understand people are going to say, oh, Neil Magny was joking. He misspoke, this and that. Neil Magny's had plenty of time to say, oh, no, that's not exactly what I meant. He's had a press conference since then. He's had plenty of times to say, look, that's not what I meant. That's taken out of context. I misspoke. He hasn't said a word. He has a 3-year-old son that he is accustomed to beating. His son has basically lived barely over 1,000 days, and he's accustomed to beating him. How many of those days are you beating your son? That's what I would like to know. That's what I would like to know. And I know there's some people that are going to say, oh, Joey, you're soft, and there's nothing wrong with spanking your son or beating your son or whatever it may be. Look, if you're imposing physical harm on children, I think you are an absolute embarrassment. And what's really disgusted me about this is the fact that the MMA community is so willing to die on that hill defending Neil Magny and saying, oh, Neil Magny meant this, Neil Magny meant that. I'm going to take Neil Magny at his words, that he is accustomed to giving out those types of beatings. Now, the only excuse you can give for this is to say, basically, well, if he's accustomed to giving out those type of beatings at UFC 292, he didn't really land a shot on Ian Garry, so he doesn't actually beat his son. And I'm not saying that Neil Magny goes home every day and pushes his 3-year-old son up against the fence and basically dirty boxes him to a 29-28 decision. I'm not saying that's what happens. But I think as an MMA fighter, as a trained professional fighter, to go to a pre-fight presser and essentially brag about abusing your 3-year-old son, that is one of the weirdest flexes I have ever heard. And that is some of the worst trash talk I have ever heard. And I 100% agree with Ian Garry calling him out. And again, I'm not saying Neil Magny's going out there and just brutalizing him and beating him up and this and that. But to imply that you're causing physical harm on a 3-year-old child, I think it's an embarrassment. And I'm glad Ian Garry called him out for it. And he used it as promotion for the fight. He said, look, I'm going to teach this guy a lesson. He's a scumbag. And so many MMA fans love these corny WWE build-ups with manufactured drama. And they absolutely love it. They eat it up when Sean O'Malley and Aljo get in the cage post-UFC 288. They love it when Brock Lesnar and DC get in the cage. They love when Conor McGregor throws the dolly. And you have all these different manufactured dramas. But when Ian Garry takes a line out of Neil Magny's own mouth and uses it as motivation and promotion to build up their fight, and then goes out there and actually beats the brakes off of him For some reason, people have a massive issue with it. They're like, oh, Ian Garry, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This is not what Neil Magny said. He's misrepresenting it. Somebody actually left a comment and said Neil Magny needs to sue for defamation. Some people are just lunatics, in my opinion. Somebody even told me, because I mentioned this in a previous video, somebody told me, oh, Neil Magny was talking about using a belt. If you're using a belt on a 3-year-old child, you need to be institutionalized. Someone needs to call Child Protective Services. And again, I know people are going to say, oh, Joey, you're so soft, this and that. I just don't believe that you should be physically abusing a 3-year-old child. I don't believe you should be abusing any child. And I think it's an embarrassment that Neil Magny basically openly admitted to it. Now, if he would have backtracked and said, oh, look, that's not what I meant. Okay, maybe it's forgivable. Maybe he just misspoke. Maybe it was just trash talk gone wrong. But the fact that the MMA community is so willing to die on that hill and defend him is so disturbing to me, because you look back and you see some of the stuff Sean Strickland has said. You know, oh, women shouldn't be allowed to work or vote. Oh, Sean Strickland's so funny. Ha, 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 ha. Then you have Israel Adesanya after KOing Alex Pereira. Oh, he taunts Alex Pereira's teenage son who's in the crowd by just pointing to him and falling to the ground. Oh, Israel Adesanya's a classless piece of shit. He's an embarrassment. Oh, so he taunted a teenager from the crowd in the cage, a teenager that previously taunted him years ago. Now he's getting his revenge on him. And now he's a classless piece of shit. But Neil Magny, who's literally admitting to beating his son, isn't. And then you have people, Dana White slaps his wife in a club in Mexico at 53 years old. And again, I haven't clutched my pearls about any of these instances at all. Not a single one that I've mentioned have I clutched my pearls about and cried about. But you have people say, oh, well, she shouldn't have hit him first, blah, blah, blah. It's a 53-year-old grown man slapping his wife in a club in Mexico, a crowded club in Mexico. What is he doing behind closed doors? If Neil Magny's bragging about child abuse in the open, I hate to see what's actually going on behind closed doors. And the MMA community's so willingness to defend Dana White for slapping his wife, to criticize Israel Adesanya for having a post-fight celebration where he taunted a teenager, to defend Sean Strickland's comments and act like Sean Strickland is so funny. Meanwhile, they act like Ian Garry just suggesting, oh, this guy's a scumbag for even saying this. Oh, but Ian Garry's the bad guy. Ian Garry's the bad guy for saying that. I think it's disturbing. I think it's disgusting. And I agree with Ian Garry. I agree, 100% agree with Ian Garry. I think he should have called him out for it. And I think it made the promotion in the lead up to the fight a little bit more interesting. And then you had Ian Machado Garry during the fight flipping off Neil Magny and kind of talking to him and taunting him a bit. And you had people say, oh, this is so classless. This is disgusting. When Nate Diaz does it, people cheerlead him. People cheerlead him when he does it. And at the end of the day, these guys are giving each other brain damage. You're worried about one grown man flipping off another grown man? That's really what we're worried about? Neil Magny may never walk the same again. He may butt scoot for the rest of his life, okay? That's how bad Ian Machado Garry beat up his legs. You're worried about the middle finger? That is craziness. These guys are giving each other brain damage. So I really think a lot of people are just hating on Ian Machado Garry for whatever reason. There's a couple things that rub them the wrong way, which if you dislike Ian Machado Garry, I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm not saying you have to like him, but what I'm saying is a lot of the criticisms, I believe personally, in my opinion, are off base. I believe they're a little bit ridiculous. I think people are kind of leaving certain context out. And I really, truly believe that people are just hating on him to hate on him. And regardless, you're playing right into his game, because when you're a fighter in the UFC, whether you're loved or hated, all that matters is that people care to watch you fight. And you know how many people are interested in seeing Ian Machado Garry fight in his next fight, whether it's rooting for him to win or whether it's rooting for him to get KO'd, and people are saying, oh, I can't wait for Ian Machado Garry to get exposed. I can't wait to see him get a step up in competition. Guess what? You're playing right into his hand, because whether you like him or love him, or you like him or hate him, you care to see him fight. So you're playing right into his hand. Another thing I want to mention, because I think it's actually hilarious, you can add Ian Machado Garry to the list of fighters in the welterweight division that deserve a title shot more than Colby Covington. And I know that's going to rub people the wrong way. Look at Ian Machado Garry's last 2 wins, Neil Magny and Daniel Rodriguez. They're not the greatest wins in the world. But guess what? Colby Covington hasn't fought in a year and a half. His last win was against Jorge Masvidal. The version of Neil Magny that showed up at UFC 292 would wreck Jorge Masvidal in probably 30-27, okay? The last win for Colby Covington was years ago. I believe it was in 2020 against Tyron Woodley. That's his last 2 fights. And they're not even recent because he was hiding in witness protection. So Ian Machado Garry, I want to make the case he deserves a title shot more than Colby Covington. And people eat up all the trash talk from Colby Covington and pretend like he's so great when he's basically being elevated off of 2 losses to Kamaru Usman. So Ian Garry, you give him enough hate, enough people like him, enough people hate him, he could leapfrog the line. It wouldn't surprise me. Ian Garry goes out there, gets a viral KO in his next fight against a top 10 opponent. He may leapfrog Bilal Muhammad and Shavkat Rakhmonov for the next title shot. Because guess what? The UFC is going to say, oh, people care about this guy. Oh, we want to build our fan base in the UK. Let's propel him to a title shot. So I just wanted to mention that towards the end of the video because I really do believe there is a case to make for that. And it's just weird that Ian Garry's kind of building this storyline up with Neil Magny. People hate him for it. But meanwhile, those same people love the Colby Covington trash talk, which is super cringy and super corny. And I think some of the Ian Garry trash talk is cringy and corny too. But for some reason, in this case, they're like, oh, Ian Garry is so cringy and corny. We hate him. We love Colby Covington. He pays somebody $5 a pop to write pre-scripted lines for him, and they eat it up. So me personally, I've become an Ian Machado Garry fan over the last 2 weeks. I wasn't really a big believer or a big fan of him up until the last few weeks. I think the Neil Magny win was really incredible. I think the striking on display looks super incredible. I believe he's a future contender in the division. He's already a contender in the division. And I think we'll see in his next fight or two, can he contend for the welterweight title? And I'm really excited to see that. Meanwhile, I think Neil Magny needs to be cut from the organization. He's already on the downslope. He got destroyed by Ian Machado Garry. And, you know, he's talking about beating his kids. He's accustomed to it. Like, oh, he wakes up at 7 o'clock in the morning, he drinks his coffee, he goes on a jog, and then he comes home and beats his 3-year-old son. He's become accustomed to it. I'm glad Ian Garry called him out for it. I think it's terrible trash talk at the bare minimum, but I just think it's egregious that the MMA community as a whole is defending him. Let me know down in the comments what you think. I'm genuinely curious of your opinion. Do you hate Ian Machado Garry? What are the reasons you hate him? Let me know. Don't forget to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.